right. Happy Sabbath. Good afternoon, everybody. I am so happy to see so many have come back this afternoon. Let me see if I can pull up my presentation. So for those of you that missed it this morning, what we were able to do was discuss what the combination, or the connection, I should say, between Adventism and, hold on, sorry everybody, 1 second. Okay, between Adventism and Black History Month. And so we went through all of that, discussed all that in its entirety. And I wanted to go back over it. For those of you that may have missed it this morning, I'm just going to kind of highlight some important things, things that you may have missed. I was told that I speak too fast, and so I'm going to try to slow down and explain some things in a little more detail. I just kind of give an overview before I go on to the slides that we missed this morning. Am I on a lag? Are you guys hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right. Share my screen. All right. So this is where we started with Black History Month, and started off with Adventist and Black history. And we discussed the Millerite movement, discussed what it was, how it relates to us as Adventists, and the Great Disappointment, and how Adventism came from one of the three groups that after the Great Disappointment, everybody kind of separated, went their own ways. One of those three sects began what we know as present-day Seventh-day Adventists. I explained what abolitionism was, or began in abolitionism. I explained what social justice was, which is justice in terms of distribution and wealth, opportunities, and privileges. And then went on to explain how there's a difference between equality, equity, and liberation. So if you look at the pictures, you can see that these are what it means to have equality. In the beginning, we were all fighting for equality. Then we decided that equity was the better way to phrase it, the better way to fight for, so that, because equality doesn't necessarily mean equal. And then at this point, the idea is to fight for liberation, which is freedom across the board, that all people, male, female, Black, white, young or old, should have the same opportunities. We talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and how many Adventists believe that we should not be a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I explained that in some parts rightfully so, because there are many in the Black Lives movement. Some of the founders of Black Lives Movement are, their lifestyle are incongruent with what we believe to be a biblical lifestyle. However, what they're fighting for are things that Adventists, the Millerite movement, how we began. This is what we were always from the beginning fighting for equality when it came to Black lives. I talked about the abolitionist movement and the newspaper that they printed. This was their logo on the newspaper, and that this newspaper, where it was printed, came out of the same printing press as where we published a lot of our circulars, a lot of our publications and our newspapers about the Advent and the Second Coming. We talked about that for a long time. We thought that Miller had separated, and we're still taught, really, if you go to theology school in the Adventist system, you're still taught that Miller separated from his Baptist roots because of the Advent, because he believed in the second coming, the imminent second coming of Jesus, and according to his calculations, he was going to come right away. But we know now in history that tells us that it was also because of slavery, that his findings in 1832, he published findings about the Advent and also published findings about slavery, and decided in that moment that he was going to be an abolitionist. which is a direct protest to pro-slavery Christians. This is a printing press I was talking about. This is the same printing press that we were printing our materials in. They were also printing abolitionist material in the same time. We talked about famous social justice advocates, people like Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X, Rosetta Douglass, which is Frederick Douglass's daughter, and the Tuskegee Airmen, where several of the Tuskegee Airmen were of the Adventist faith. We also talked about how even though people assumed that Africa was full of darkness and there was nothing nothing good could come out of Africa, that in actuality, it is known not only in Ghana, but across the continent that many African countries already knew who the God of the Sabbath was. And I explained how even what we call the Sabbath as a culture has always been about the Sabbath, has always referred to a Sabbath. So even before we were converts to Adventism, we knew about a Sabbath. We knew about a God that rested on the Sabbath. So we talk about Ellen G. White and how she's often misquoted when discussing racism. There are things that people have said that she has said, and she indeed said them, but they take them out of context. So for the 3 or 4 or 5 things that she said that seemingly said to speak against Adventism, in reality, what she was saying had very little to do with what people are assuming that she said. They didn't read it all the way through. There have been more publications about her documenting anti-slavery than anything else. She thoroughly spoke about anti-slavery for all her life. And she believed in reparations, which is paying slaves back for what they lost. And she was against Adventists owning slaves and for education and medical care. And these are the 2 writings that people take out of context when she was actually doing it to protect us. She was doing it to say, at this moment in time, it is best for us to be separate because people were dying. People were being persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan and different people. And so she thought for the push of the gospel to go further, it was best for us to be separated. But it was supposed to be a short period of time. We were never supposed to have Black and white conferences to this day. It was supposed to be a very small period of time. And then we were to come together. And then it just continued afterwards. And it wasn't supposed to. So we know that what she did indeed have much to say, such as this quote where she says slavery is a sin of the darkest eye. So if you want, you can read it if you're I'm looking at the screen. I read all these through earlier this morning, but these are just several quotes that she said that we know she was an advocate for anti-slavery. This is another one I'll give you a few minutes to read it. For those of you that were not here this morning, but it basically says that, she ostracized somebody who was for an Adventist who was for slavery. And she says that you don't look at it in the right light. And matter of fact, we should not be walking with you. We should not be in fellowship with you at all. And these are not things that we want to be a part of our church. And that, it's just something that we don't believe in. We got to about here, this one in the next slide. Okay, this is where we kind of stopped off. So this one is the foundation of Adventism, where people who fought for equal rights and against slavery. And we want to know what happened to us. Why did we forget our roots? This is the very last slide we talked about, and I have a few ones after this, and then we can do some questions. And basically, for those of you that weren't here in the morning, during World War II, the FBI did some investigations of religious groups. They felt like there were some religious groups that were seen as un-American, unpatriotic, liberal, socialist, and radical. We were a part of that. Adventists were a part of that group that they felt like was liberal, socialist, and radical because we spoke up against slavery. So we were not seen as the conservatives that we are seen as today. And back then, we used to publish works about the beast with 2 horns like a lamb and speaks with the voice of a dragon. And we attributed this to the United States. They didn't like it because it said that it made it seem as if you weren't American or that you were against America. And so they put it out there to say, well, you need to remove this. So back then, what we were teaching is that each of the horns, one was religious liberty and one was social liberty. And we were teaching this across the board. I think by the end of World War II, we were preaching a whole different message saying that the beast would, or the lamb would in the future speak with the voice of a dragon. So that what was coming was in the future and hadn't already happened. And this had an effect on what we consider to be what our cause for racism and anti-slavery in our church, because that means that these things, when it comes to religious liberty and social liberty, it would be affected in the future, and it isn't affected now. So it's not our problem now. It will become a problem in the future, versus it is our problem and we're dealing with it right now. So instead of leading with that we always led with, we changed it to lead with something softer, like the health message. So it was easier to go into communities with the health message than it was to go into communities with this message. And we didn't want to go to jail. They were literally going to jail us. So they thought that we were German spies. So they started jailing missionaries that went overseas. They were throwing SDAs into insane asylums for no reason. They weren't insane, but to get rid of people, they were throwing people into insane asylums. So what happened, and I didn't write this down, but there was, people thought that Jehovah's Witnesses and Adventists were the same. Before Jehovah's Witness, they were the Bible Institute, something along those lines. That's what they call themselves. And people would get us mixed up. And so because they found that Jehovah's Witnesses at the time were anti-American, what they thought, that kind of brushed into what we are as Adventists. So there were actually Jehovah's Witnesses before they came to Adventists. There were Jehovah's Witnesses that went to jail for 80 years. They were jailed for 80 years for 4 consecutive trips of 20 years each. And so we knew that it was a real thing, that this was real, that they weren't just telling us that you're going to jail, because there was already a precedent that somebody had gone to jail over speaking over what they thought was un-American. So we decided to back down, and we decided to stop preaching what we knew to be the truth, because we knew that it would send us to jail, give us large fines in our church, or that they would shut us down. And so we used to preach that it looked like a lamb because it claims to protect religious liberty and civil liberties or social liberties. This is what we taught, that it was a lamb because it claimed to protect religious liberty, civil liberty, and social liberty. But it speaks like a dragon because it denies religious liberty and civil and social liberties to the religious and racial minorities. I hope you're following me. This is the reason that we were using this prophecy. So all this is what I'm trying to say, that once that prophecy changed, the fallout from that and everything else began to shift as well. Once some tenets that we stood firmly on began to shift, other things began to shift. So if the dragon is no longer, if the dragon isn't currently speaking like a dragon against civil or social liberty, or it has nothing to do with civil or social liberty and more to do with religious liberty, that's where we went. It was more about religious liberty versus social liberty. And because we separated the two, right, we no longer fought for racism. We never fought for slavery because we didn't have to. The dragon wasn't about social liberty. It was about it was about religious liberty. Okay. And so instead of saying the lamb was doing that right now in presence, we moved it to the dragon will be speaking this way. The lamb will speak this way as a dragon in the future. And what we know now is the lamb is currently speaking like a dragon. It never stopped. Like we act like it took a break. That's how we preach. Like there was a time of post-racial. There's like a post-racial place where everything is fine. We're all able to get in buses. We're able to sit at counters. We're able to kind of go through the front door and the back door. Therefore, everything is fine. And that's not the case. It just became a more hidden seduction, really, of the enemy from the United States. So in continuation, and this stuff is going to blow your mind. If you need references, please reach out to me afterwards. I have a lot of references to give to you. But this is all stuff you can Google. This is on Ellen G. White stuff that you can Google in history of the church. So after World War I, we continue this same message under pressure, and continue saying that the lamb is all this that we're talking about is in the future, because we're so afraid of being seen as a cult. So many of you, especially as young Adventists, you've heard somebody say, well, isn't the SDA Church a cult? This is where it came from. the FBI basically labeled us as a cult. They labeled us as dangerous. They labeled us as seditionists. They labeled us as just people that, were not supposed to be in a part of the American culture. And so we went so far the other way in order to prove that we were not socialists. So we became wanting so much to be under the cover, under the radar, we decided to adapt some evangelical and conservative sentiments. We decided that we would much rather, link ourselves with conservatism and evangelicalism. You can say that. I don't know if that's a word. You know what I'm saying? to that part versus being on the other side, where we could be jailed or be ostracized or have a target on our back. And we continue to stay silent during many big social issues because of politics. I didn't write it here, but it included in South Africa and apartheid. There were many, many white South Africans who were Adventists, had whole Adventist churches that did not allow Black South Africans to be a part of their membership. Nazi Germany, there are many Adventists in America as well as Germany that believed that what Hitler was doing was correct. Matter of fact, it is documented that the Adventist, my mind is slipping. What is our large? I'm sorry, guys. Give me a second. Not the union. What is the big corporation?
Conference?
A general conference. Thank you. I'm tired, guys. I'm sorry. The general conference. It's documented that the general conference actually invited an Adventist woman who was German who believed in eugenics. And eugenics is basically talking about race, basically that there's a higher race and a lower race, and trying to basically rid certain areas of certain races that don't belong. And she was Adventist. They actually invited her here to speak to churches. Okay. So this is how racial we got. This is how, in Rwanda, there were entire Adventist pastors and congregations that participated in killing people, fully participated, fully knew that, and people were running to their churches because they thought, I'm going to run to this Adventist church and I'm going to be protected because it's the Adventist church, not knowing they were running into a trap. Okay. So once we went away from our stance of anti-slavery, equal race, things started seeping into our system and into our organization that were never meant to be there. So Adventism became watered down and racist ideologies took over, which is very sad. So you heard what I said before, how we started. How did we get here? And it's to hear how far it's gotten. It blows my mind. And so we're going to go back a few years. Something happened in 1890 in St. Louis, Missouri. There were members that were brought into a church. These were Black members, and they came to know the truth through evangelical meetings. They were shown a local church in St. Louis, Missouri. When those Black people started attending the church, they were mistreated so severely that Ellen G. White heard of it and was grieved. It hurt her so much that, there are letters and writings that say that every time she thought about it, it was like a trauma to her. Because she realized that those people that were mistreated, they left the church. They never came back. And she saw them as precious souls that had been pushed away because of this sin, because of this race ideology. And around that same time, she had a vision. And in that vision, she heard God say, all ye are brethren. And she wrote that down. And she used that stance to speak at the General Conference in 1891. And the title of her what she said was Our Duty to Colored People. Very soon after, she was sent to Australia. There are a lot of Black Adventist scholars, historians who believe that she was sent to Australia because they were trying to get her out of the way. Okay, so she did a lot of writing from Australia, and a lot came out of that. But she was sent to, there's more, for other reasons she was sent to Australia, but one of the reasons was because they were trying to get her to stop talking about racial issues. All right, so another thing that is wanted to note is Ellen G. White, basically, it says Ellen White receives the historic vision at Roosevelt, New York, revealing the horrible curse and degradation of slavery. She declares God is bringing judgment against America for the high crime of slavery, and that God will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. So she said that she had a dream, and that dream, God had told her that the Civil War was him passing judgment. The Civil War was him, basically declaring judgment on those that would want to keep slaves and thought that it was a good idea, Adventists, Christians, whoever they were. So it's very telling that everything that happened, she in her writing, I'll give you the link for it, whoever asked me for it, is that she actually envisions the enemy, Satan, actually orchestrating a lot of what was happening in the South. Here's some more quotes from Ellen G. White. It says, there are colored people who are true and faithful. The color of skin does not determine character in the heavenly courts. So she made this a spiritual issue. She felt like those that could not understand why it was bad to have a slave, why it was bad to be racist, was a spiritual issue. Early Adventists believed America was exceptional, but also believed that it was cursed. So in the beginning, what we kind of based our preaching on was that we love America, but it's a cursed place. And she actually wrote and said slavery cursed the very soil of America. And the Great Atonement, what the Great Atonement was, and believed that Great Atonement and believed the Civil War was God's problem. And so there are people that believed that the Civil War, like I said, as a belief, as people that were fighting against each other, was God saying, I have a problem. This is problematic, and I'm going to do something about it. And so he actually used men to help fight against the Civil War. And she says your feelings towards slavery were the reason that some would not be making it into heaven. She felt like it was such a spiritual issue that there were people that would not make it to heaven because of what they viewed about Black people. And so what does this all mean? It means that we are called to be reformers. Adventism was created out of protest. Y'all, we are protesters at our core. So when we're at home watching people in the streets protest about a Black man on the street and we're like, that's them. No, we're supposed to lead that. We were supposed to be in the forefront of that. We've always been in the forefront of that. We're called to speak up when we see God's people under attack. Of all the people that should have had something to say about Black lives and police brutality, it should have been us. And we were quiet. We were silent. We are called to set the captives free. We are called to stop prejudice within our own ranks. That should say our, sorry, instead of out. But even within the Ghanaian community, we have prejudices against each other. We have things, tribalism against each other, right? And so you can think about this as a problem that just happens in America. But anything in your mind that tells you that person is less than you, that doesn't deserve what you have, that is below you, is a spiritual issue. Whether it's tribalism, whether it's a Black or white issue, whether it's a country issue, whatever it is. And so when we say things like, when we use like terms like akata or certain words that the way we will say it in front of our children, the way we'll talk about Black people in front of our children is a reflection of who we are. It's a reflection of our own spiritualism. And Ellen G. White was completely against it. So in conclusion, here is one of my favorite quotes from her as I was searching through my research. She says, a scene was presented before me. I saw two souls struggling in the waters. The waves were beating high about them and they were ready to perish. One of these persons was white, the other Black. This is a dream she's having. Then I saw one come to their rescue. With one hand he held hold of the white man. On the other hand, he grasped the black, and together drew them to a place of safety. Both knelt at the feet of their rescuer, and both glorified his name. And so I hope that that paints a picture, an accurate picture of who we are as Adventists, who we began, what we should be doing from here on out. Many of us didn't know this, right? We really should be in our communities. We really should be, whenever there's an issue about Black lives, about brown lives, about whatever it is, we should be right there with them, advocating for them. And because we have wanted to be kind of under the radar for so long, we have chosen to be quiet. We have chosen not to take a stance on anything and see everything as political. Y'all, we began as a political movement, period. We began as reformers against the norm, against the policies of the day. We spoke against it, period. So every time we are silenced, we are actually feeding into the enemy's goal to silence us. There are a lot of white Adventists out there that are racist, and they have been racist for so long, not knowing that the reason that you are an Adventist is because somebody decided that Black people should have equality. Have no idea. I mean, Uncle Kingston told us a story about him and his wife going into a church and how badly they treated them because they were Black. My parents have stories. Everybody has stories about the way, and yet we are still here. And yet we're still here, which I think is amazing and it's beautiful. And I wish I would have known this as a teenager or a college student. I wish I would have known how cool, really it is, our church is. But instead, we spend so much time, as we should, but I feel almost too much time on things that don't matter, on things that have no spiritual consequence, right? And so I'm going to open it up for questions here. If anybody has any questions, I don't know everything about everything, so please don't ask me hard questions. I can lead you in the right direction, but I'm happy to have the floor open and see if we can have some discussion about this.
Is Christian on? I know that he had some questions this morning. Christian, are you there?
You can also put it in the chat. If there's somebody here that doesn't want to say it, but want to put it in the chat, then that might be a way to do it as well.
Tati, this is
Yes.
Marjorie.
Hello, Ma.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Can we say that the existence of Black and white conferences in this country, is it as a result of what Mrs.
Yes, it is a direct result. So what happened, remember I explained in the beginning that at one point she had said it was wise for us to separate. It was wise because even though we as missionaries were going down to the South trying to resurrect churches, people were being killed because we were trying to bring churches together. So Jim Crow, those laws, it's something called Jim Crow laws, and those laws basically would not allow Black people to do the same thing as white people. We could not look at each other. We couldn't go on the same doors. We couldn't drink from the same water fountains. We had to sit in the back of the bus, not the front of the bus. I mean, all these things. And so when these white people are coming down to Texas trying to make a church where Black and white people were in the same church, it was controversial. And it tore everything apart. And there are Ku Klux Klan coming after them, trying to kill them. I mean, going after their children and their families. And so it got to the point where Ellen was like, you know what, listen, the gospel truth will penetrate no matter what. Let's separate for now. Let's keep it separate for now. Matter of fact, she even mentioned people always use this quote, and she did say it, that there should not be interracial marriage. She said at that time, for that time period, because people were being killed, literally being snatched away from their families, fathers and mothers, and leaving orphans because they were interracial. So she felt like for that moment, it was the best. What happened was people got comfortable. So there were Black conferences that were raising up Black pastors. So even Oakwood, Ellen G. White was one of the founders of Oakwood. She believed in it that much. And after she died, part of her estate, she donated money to Black education. So a percentage of her when you die, what is that? Her will was given to Black education. That's how much she believed in it. Okay. And so what was happening, we started raising up our own pastors. We started raising up our own kind of our own culture within that. And so it became easier. Now, when it was time to come together, it became political, because what was happening is every time that it was successful, every time two conferences decided, you know what, this is not the will of God. It happened, I think, in Missouri. This is not the will of God. Let's bring it together. 9 times out of 10, the Black pastors would lose out, because it was easier for a white pastor to pastor a Black mixed church than it is for a Black pastor to pastor a mixed church. It's still very racist, right? But it is more, white people have a certain way that they like to worship, and they think that we're a little too much, okay? And so what was happening is Black pastors were losing their jobs, and white people were not making amends for it. They weren't, and then Black pastors were losing their pension. They were losing the stuff that they worked really, really hard for in order to kind of bring it back together. And this got to the point where it was like, people, it's too much. And so we remain at odds. We remain there, but that's not how it was supposed to be. She said for that time period, and it continued even after she died. And that was never the intention. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
There's a question in the chat. Sethy, are you seeing it?
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I know yesterday Pastor gave a presentation about passing down the negative part of history as a Christian. My question is it bad to know the good and the bad of history, especially Black history? I'm trying to understand your question. Could you explain that a little bit more? I'm so sorry. Do you understand what he's asking?
I think that question was specific to you, because I don't see it, but I do see one that's to everyone here.
Oh, okay. So that other question, if you could ask that same question to Amma, maybe Amma can help me explain
Yes,
what I'm asking. Yes.
Yeah, Pastor,
Oh, Christian, hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I know, say like yesterday on that Pastor, my presentation, Pastor is on the line, so if I misunderstood him, he can correct me.
Okay, sure.
But he was talking about, how sometimes, we talk about, if I say the bad side of history, not sometimes, everybody passes down some kind of hatred, develop hatred for the other side and stuff like that. I don't know if that's the main intention of talking about, the goods and the bads of history, but I think that, with history, sometimes it's ugly.
Yes, very.
And it's better to know the ugly and the good side of it.
Yes.
Just so that you can make informed decisions going forward.
Yes.
Going forward. But I quite don't understand where Pastor was trying to get. And she said, maybe Uncle to me, I explain it be more.
Sure, Pastor, if you're on, if you could answer that. And Portia, I see you, by the way. I see your hand is up, so I'll get to you.
Yeah, sure. Now, me kind of say,
Yes.
the way Onyankopon is see, Onyankopon per se, we have to pass on what the Lord has asked us to do. They not make up history. Untimi enkase na adene time, but a good. That untimi enmane history. But in all that we learned from God, Nyao can say, adene say na etie na air time. Your country Israel for say, Munkan chere mama say, na mo won kwasum and I mean de ba say more than you. And always, you can't baby na enye. How did we get here? Then we give hope to the children and say, "Bibi say anysia, look up to God." Said ya beya, Nankopon a ode yen no, Martin Luther so na ode yen ofa South Africa President Mandela. So now Mandela come out and say, I'm not going to be in a call for country and saying, "Can also see our president," you know, and can also. No, that is not that. When you know, or say everything happened to glorify God. And when she omayi bitterness at train, but when you make up Mama Yemfa or Asia or Moka. When she Sana Uhe and Coupon Swa Uno, Yang a Christo for the way I passing on the history. And to me, and pass a year, and a 7 casana a paper, but we want to make it sweet. But what we want to say is that the thing was so cruel, the thing was so wickedness, but the Lord has glorified himself in it. And when you mama then say you can't, you be we say you could be na acquire say literality. You can't say respond in the equal manner. Said you be violence I also Americans is here, you know, a fan p intina said na ya or can say said ye abrofono SDA and history now a very bad but the entire 7-day Adventist in support of Black Lives Matter and they said in all life matter. Nipa omoha ye nipa omoye omunyina so no mename enchen abon eno nti na yem follow say yen nyese bia yenyin tum say ade na course na airtime ena course no na airtime nyame ne nye ho and I can sing bia I'm going to write it against a witness name as one of the coach. I mean yefra addition was say any attempt to look down upon one another is a spiritual issue. Brebia certainly I'm going to tag your name on this as your coach. Say Brebia ube look down upon unye a spiritual issue. There's who go or tamfa on some line. Me cherry, me look down cherry Ghana for we and it is all the back from one to me who said it is within Black Martin Luther could a good to be. Or say Black hatred in po a chain abroad here. Or say Black against the hatred against Black to Black, no. A cruel time. Even white against Black. So, and there can was a spiritual issue. Until at the end of the day, no, okay, we are not glorify God, whereby we can you move on the next level. No, so you be a day as give by you. That is why I was trying to draw attention. Christian.
Akram person me ka honi. Say you share beginning of the early church, you know. Paul be Christoni who move through a free near now be a Christoni, you know. Eventually, sector no woman a Jew for no a town. He was persecuted by his own people for preaching Christ. And you know, Paul never ever retaliated. At one time when Paul said Peter was behaving just like the people who said, well, who's a Gentile say, well, no, no, or train hono. Paul, it wasn't a fight. And Quanque be a Jew for near Yentino, a one and a Christopher be the excuse to a chiano, and no coin say, woman tiasi. And it yes, and never cost winning in ano. And what? Now, being Christians, we have to be very careful when we are supporting cause beer. And Crawford Eddie and then Tokwa and never say and air side. Yes, 1824. Black Lives Matters never cost me no a Kayimbi. Nelson never be honema 1 more year. To say the nano a course or a White House. Christian evangelist from saying evangelist group, you know. Evangelist support near Ecosway. So you Christonia, do you have to take a stand to support Adea, Edibasabasa, Ebo Maimu? We have to be very careful. Trust me, Unyame Makwan say, ye ne nkrofo beka bomu na ye basabasa sa ya tan nkrofo ya kum nkrofo anase ye tuatu ya nkrofo. And yes, ye tuntumfo, but we also have to be very careful when we are taking a stance against or for some of these issues. Na mayetimi am ye nyam samka etimi akura ni mu daachi. So could participate in anything beyond say ye who say SDA for support say ya that be ye nyam samka bayadi. We must be for all blacks and whites. Yet me and yam samka so etimi akura ni say yes me dase.
Thank you so much, Uncle. And so on that, I'm going to
come. Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Sati, just make the call.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure we have a Portia who has had her hand raised. I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions as well. So if you don't mind, she's gonna ask her a question. You can come back to it if that's okay. She was one of the first people to raise her hand.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Portia.
Thank you. So before, I just want to say thank you very much for the presentation. At least personally for me, it was very eye-opening, and I've had a lot of questions about like the history of Adventists. Mostly I've heard the same, like the founding of it and the Millerites and all the Great Disappointment, but honestly, I've heard the white version of it. I always wonder if like Black people was involved or anything like that. And this was kind of like, oh, we were really involved into it and the way Adventists started. So my question is that when you talk about like Black Life Matter and all this movement, at least for me, someone who grew up in Ghana almost 13 years of my life and being in America for like 7 years, I always feel like in a way culturally appropriating if I'm more involved into like when people talk about discussion about like slavery and like discrimination and stuff like that. I personally not sure exactly what to say, since when I was growing up, the only difference was the fact that this person like lives from here, or this person was from Teshuman or from Accra or Kumasi. So for me, it's always never, I always feel like with those conversations or being supportive of those things was me not respecting Black people in a way, due to the fact that I feel like I wasn't involved, or like I can't really trace back to any ancestry being in slavery, even though slavery and all of these things were part of Black people's history. And, you know, Black people didn't just come here on their own, they were brought here. So is that a bad ideology to think of? Or like, I don't know how, like it, I always, in a way, I know we're supposed to, like, God love all of us and we're supposed to stand up for people, but I also don't know. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how far is too far? How far do I like support when they're talking about Black Lives Matter? Because for me, I can't give like personal stories of the school that I went to or something like that, because yes, I went to a mixed school and most of the time I was the only Black person there, but there were other Black people too, and I was treated different even by the African Americans. So I'm like, how do I support like when it comes to these protests and stuff like that without being disrespectful to them in a way?
So there within this fight, there are several sections of this fight. There are people that are direct descendants of slaves within this country, and then there are allies. As Africans from the continent, not ones that were enslaved, we would be considered allies. So you can be a support of the messaging and be considered an ally. There are white people that are allies. There are, brown people that are allies, people that understand the messaging and also agree with the messaging, right? And so what happens is a lot of our youth are very confused. Like even I think Pastor spoke in it and Uncle King spoke in it about whether we can be out there marching, right? So we don't know what to do. Our parents say we can't go march, but yet we feel like there's something that we have to say. We are also watching these Black bodies being shot in the street. We are also watching it and then coming to church and nobody's saying anything about it. Coming to church and there's no sermon about it. There's no mention about it. There's no let's pray. There's nothing about it. And so what happens, especially Black people that go to white churches, where they go to white Adventist church and nothing is mentioned. You're like, well, did you not just see the news? I saw the news. You didn't see the news? We're not going to talk about this, right? And so what happens is something happens where you don't feel tied to your church. And so what this is about is understanding that your church was an integral part of this movement from the beginning. The issue is that the Black Lives Movement as it stands is not the problem. It's when they start adding like LGBTQ rights into it, and they start adding your trans rights into it, start adding like all these feminist rights into it, and they start making this organization that was solely based on Black Lives Matter into something else. What we don't understand is LGBTQ, the community, they believe themselves to be allies of the Black Lives Matter. Okay? White people consider Black or heterosexual that consider themselves to be allies of the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay? So if it is difficult for us to try to say that because Black lives is what they are, that we're not going to do anything about it. What I am proposing, and it's a little bit late, we should have been doing this from the beginning, is that we should have had our own organization. We should have had our own separate situation from the beginning, years and years and years and years ago, that got up and banded together and marched every single time something happened. That means that they would have to come to us. They would have had to ask us, can we join you? They would have had to be a part of us versus us begging to be a part of them. So because Black Lives Matter is a leading organization, right? It doesn't mean that we can't do our own. We can still, as we can raise up our own organization. We just don't have the gumption. That's a big word. We don't have the want, the desire, the drive, right? To do, because we like being home, we like being comfortable. And so to me, I know we are often against Black Lives Matter, but they're doing something. Something is better than nothing in a lot of the regard. Right. And also, I want us to understand, Uncle King's, I think, no, somebody said this. I don't know if Uncle King's or Pastor said it. We have to make sure our language, when we say all lives matter, we are actually pushing against it. OK, so make sure that when we're saying things, saying even the reference all lives matter, it brings Black Lives Matter to a mute point. It makes they're not, they can be one and the same. So you can say Black Lives Matter, right? And still mean all lives matter, because Black lives mattering means that all lives matter. But all lives matter doesn't mean that Black lives matter. I hope that makes sense. So I think sometimes as Africans, we say things, we don't realize that is actually a hurtful thing to say. I think
I'm in here for 1 second.
Yes, go ahead. Nana, please.
Understand the frustration of our young Adventist generation these days. Should we go out to march, or should we not go out to march? Should we take arms and fight for ourselves? The only solution we can suggest is the method of Christ. When John the Baptist was beheaded, Christ was informed. He could have led the Black Lives Matter and would have gotten a lot of support at that time. What we know is that he went and prayed and set us an example, which was far more powerful than any marching. I'm not against marching or anything of that nature. What I'm saying is that our frustration is understandable and is appreciable, but we should never forget the method that Christ led us. When Nero burned the whole of Rome and blame it on the Christians, Paul was there, but he took up a pen and wrote, "Honor your leaders." He could have left the Black Lives Matter and gotten a lot of demonstration done. Because we're all humans, oftentimes we see the injustice. I'm glad you mentioned this morning that Seventh-day Adventism existed because of social justice. And most of the founding members were all Seventh-day Adventists. But we should always work within the method that Christ left us. When the disciples went to Samaria and requested for lodging, they were refused. John, the disciple of Christ, says, "Let us command fire from heaven to burn them." If you want a place to sleep and I don't have a place for you to sleep, should you burn me? What happened to the Sanhedrin Why didn't you command fire from heaven to burn them? In order in this society for us to victimize a certain group of people, first of all, we have to dehumanize them. I'm making this a little bit deeper. When the Rwandans wanted to kill the Tutsis, they said that these were cockroaches, and it's easy to step on a cockroach and kill it. When the Germans wanted to destroy the Jews, they said they were rats. When the white America wanted to destroy the blacks, they said these are inhuman, these are monkeys, these are whatever names they give us, 3/5 of a man. Even though the government has elevated us to full manhood, their knees are still on our necks. This issue is not a marching issue, it's a spiritual issue. And the only way we can solve it is not through the human method, but the method of Christ. And Christ and the disciples have left us examples throughout the Bible. This topic that Sati has brought is very, very deep. I have started writing a book on that already, looking back in order to go forward. The younger generation needs to know our history, our involvement, our suffering to be able to answer the meaning of now. But just as Pastor said, we should always leave them to a point where they will not take arms, but they will prepare themselves to redeem God's people. And this is the example of Moses. When he was ready to march, Black Lives Matter, Hebrew lives matter, he had to go and stay in the desert and unlearn all the worldly methods that he had learned for 23 years. Alan G. White says it took God 40 years to untrain him from the anger and the pain that he had in his heart in order to use the method of Christ. The only way Black Americans can free themselves is not to use the method of the worldly people, but to use the method of Christ in our struggle. And before we go out to march, Black Lives Matter, first of all, we need to be sure that God has prepared us. But Sati, we will revisit this topic again. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Just a point of let's try to keep. There are more questions, I know. Let's try to keep whatever questions you have very short. We need to be at. It's supposed to be board meeting, and so they've given us until 6:45. If anybody has a question or something to say, please keep it brief so we can get all of them in.
Teddy, there was a question in the chat. It says, "Why do we Africans think we are different from how the whites see blacks?" Go ahead.
So what happened years ago is that before Black people could really be who they were in this country, Africans were allowed to be. So if you trace back our history, our African leaders were allowed in our institutions here in America. So we have leaders that were students at Harvard, right? Leaders that were students at Oxford. And people, we were seen as better than them in some regards. They didn't see us as a threat because our roots were not based in slavery. We didn't hate them. We have no reason to hate you, no reason to bring any retribution towards you. And we were, coming for school and going back, right? Back then, it was to come to school to learn how people do their democracy and their government and their school systems and going back. And so we missed the mark when it came to how they were being dealt with, because we were being dealt with a little bit better, with a little more respect, a little more dignity, okay? And so that kind of trickled down into the idea that we are better than them, and also because they lack what we would consider culture. A lot of Africans believe that African Americans lack culture. They don't know where they came from, the way they act, the way they talk, the way they dress, the way they eat, all these things. We become better than them. And we forget that even after slavery, a lot of things happened. There was Jim Crow laws. There was redlining. They couldn't live where they wanted. They couldn't go to schools where they wanted. mass incarceration for petty crime. Someone just had a small bag of weeds and they're in jail for 100 years, right? It's an exaggeration, but you know, the smallest things they were over policed. So families were without parents, families were without fathers. Okay. And so all these things happened to them to create a culture that we didn't understand, that we felt like was different. Why won't they just, if they would just, if you know what I'm saying. Okay. And then we decided that